Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Logan Ward, and I created this film, Remarkable Voices from the Trans Community. This picture actually is a friend of mine, and they created this image completely separate from the documentary of the same thinking that, we're a marked community and there's a target on our back. And I just thought that was really beautiful that so many of us are thinking so many of the same things. So I, of course, compensated them for the image and wanted to share that as well. It's created by Lyric Sullivan. So, my goals in creating this film and now with my talk today is to share my perspective with those who are not allied with the trans community and also provide what I believe to be more effective talking points for allies when we are inevitably challenged on our support for the community. So, the creation of this film took about 11 months, and it was born out of what I learned in my media design master's program at Emerson College. And the media design program emphasizes community-centered design and expanded my knowledge about media production, applied research, and project-based inquiry. And that basically is any project that involved an expert subject power dynamic, which is and typically a marginalized group as well. And we aimed to add extra steps that made the project more fair and gave more power and ownership to the people being studied. And these steps included a clear written agreement before the project, feedback loops, and any other practices that could increase transparency and trust between the stakeholders. And we also used the term participatory design for sometimes, you create participatory spaces, and then also making sure that you're centering the community as a concept in itself. So there are so many parallel ideas here. And and also the term design is used very broadly to mean any project that would allow us to repair these unequal distributions of power within various fields. So, although in this graphic, which was created by community-based journalist Sue Robinson, is only speaking of the journalist field here, please know that any of the terms can be applied to many other fields, and you can find that all these areas and titles have extremely similar goals of empowering marginalized communities and rebuilding public trust towards the media. And the media design program is now being embedded into the journalism program at Emerson College and is coming to an end. Um, but it's in an effort to raise the ethical standards of the next generation of journalists. So it's a really great effort. So yeah, once I finished my program, I spent the next few months building up my freelance business. I'm an illustrator as well, which is why I created the animations within the film. And then I released the documentary on November 20th, 2024. But let's get back to the beginning. Like, how did I get here? How did I make the film? So it started with two research papers. So the first one, they found that there were lower PrEP levels in trans women's blood. And they concluded that trans women lacked an adherence, their lack of adherence to standards, they weren't following the standards, is likely caused by healthcare providers' lack of necessary expertise to supervise the hormone therapy, which is fair. Glad they mentioned that. And also the wish to maximize and accelerate feminization. So then they're putting the onus on the trans women. And then, so that was in 2009. And then three transgender studies conducted in 2019 concluded that use of feminizing hormones was associated with reduced PrEP concentrations in blood, suggesting that reduced efficacy of oral PrEP is not merely the result of lower adherence amongst transgender women. So we're basically making assumptions about trans women's ability to take their medication instead of asking them more about it. Tells us a lot about how these trans women were not really involved in the research in a lot of ways. And then in these transcenter studies, they're finally able to figure that out. So this led me to Julia Serrano. Her writing helps me challenge the cisnormative belief that we should be questioning the intentions of trans people. And so I that was her book, Excluded, that began me on that trend and started to think about that. And her writing also opened up this door for me because I had never questioned the process that a doctor had to write a letter for me to go get my hormones and to get surgery. I just accepted what was, it was a little bit annoying, but I didn't think that there was an alternative. And then she was in her writing asking, well, why do we even have these barriers? Like, why can't trans people just go and ask for what they need and then receive that? And so, yeah, but it's expensive, right? So we need insurance to cover it. So, uh, whether it's diagnosis or professional sign off, um, these there are still barriers to care either way, and they're both discriminatory and helpful in certain ways because we're able to get insurance. But so I start to think about like what's a good reason for medical transition? And it's really just because, trans people want to transition, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so I start to question like why was it hard for me to accept that trans people just want to transition, right? Like why can't we just hear someone's perspective on their identity and trust that and let them move forward with the medical interventions that they say are helpful to them? I mean, so our desire to transition is no less important than a cis man wanting to not have breasts as a result of hormonal imbalance or other medical conditions. This is a real thing. This is a great movie where we see this happen. So, why can't more people respect our bodily autonomy? So, many people fear that it's unsafe or that we'll regret it or that we're uninformed. Um, and typically, that fear of being uninformed also ties into that fear that people transition for the wrong reasons. Once again, assuming the intentions of trans people. But all of that ties into all of these different invalidations within Julia Serrano's markedness theory. So, Julia Serrano's theory of markedness shows us that our value system for information is actually about who we trust. So, our radar for what is true is actually based on our own biases and preconceptions of others. Unless we're actively working against the cis-normative societal norms that we're taught about, we're bound to unconsciously categorize trans people as having untrustworthy subjective perspectives. So, don't have to blame yourself about it. I mean, this is what we're fed, this is the information we're given, but it's good to have an active effort towards undoing this thinking. But markedness can apply to traits and identities, but ultimately affects the person with these traits or identities, and the impact compounds for people who have multiple marked identities, such as Asian trans women, disabled trans people, etc. And in our interview, Julia also spoke to me about how celebrities are considered marked, but it's that final point that it's also the double standard that makes it true marginalization, right? So it's there, even if a celebrity messes up in some way, if they're a cis white uh, man and they're able to talk their way out of it in some way, right? They're not truly as affected by it as other people. So, yes, marginalization leads to bias, difficulty being hired, homelessness, social isolation. And these are all factors that can create circumstances for depression and suicidal ideation. We do have reasons that it's necessary to transition: autonomy, trust and respect, and suicide prevention. But that last one I actually don't agree with, and it was more of a talking point that I saw a lot when I was researching comment sections, looking through what people have to say. And um, what I found is that a lot of pro-trans people claim that we have to let trans people transition because they might commit suicide, and the framing of it is dangerous because anti-trans people typically perceive this as a threat in some way. And that doesn't mean that's the intention of it, but we have to think about it from a trauma-informed approach. And typically, a threat of suicide being a part of the conversation is unfortunately language that is commonly used by abusers, and people who may have experienced that won't be as receptive to that explanation. And that doesn't mean that it's not important to bring up those subjects with people who maybe haven't experienced trauma or in that area, or maybe who are more supportive of the trans community. But with people who aren't supportive of our community, they have trouble empathizing with us. And also, I mean, we don't really know who's experienced trauma and who hasn't, right? But it just can be dangerous, and it's not always received in the way that we may think it is. So thinking about, how could we create better dialogue? How could we steer clear of, dangerous territory? And so what I think we should mention is the benefits of transition and how awesome our community is. So for myself personally, I feel like I recognize myself in the mirror. I feel comfortable with my body in ways that I haven't since I was young, and I didn't have as many gender expectations pushed upon me. I have a better relationship with my family and my friends, and I feel closer to them because I feel like they understand me better now, right? And I'm more comfortable giving and receiving hugs. There's a whole lot of my life that is better because of my transition. I think these are really great things to bring up to people because people just don't know a lot about our community, right? So they need to hear more of our experiences. And of course, that also means they need to be willing to listen. But oh, but yeah, well, and I read a lot about society and gender expectations, and because of that, it makes me a more philosophical person and also a conceptual artist. So that's what this is here, an example of my work. All right, so what I realized is just that when in conversation with people who are completely opposed to gender affirming care, in order to help them empathize with our community, we have to answer why support for our community is beneficial, which is where I ended up using one of the major ideas from my program, which is designing from the margins. And I realized that trans kids are ultimately the most marginalized community within the trans community because they lack bodily autonomy, they're unable to vote, and they're viewed as too young to know. About 24 minutes into the documentary, I say, trans medicine isn't perfect, but we have the tools to improve the medicine and the research, and focusing on what should be taken away from the community as opposed to what could be done to help our community is the definition of marginalization. This is in response to anti-trans narratives that trans kids are being pushed to transition. And while I don't agree with these fears and false narratives, it is necessary that we dive deeper into these concerns so that we can focus on ways to gain support for lawmakers and medical staff that oppose gender affirming care for youth. In the example of WPATH, in the spring of 2024, the organization received criticism because of what was said in a leaked conversation between medical professionals, when one said that trying to explain losing the ability to procreate in the future to a 13-year-old was like speaking to a brick wall. The response from anti-trans media organizations was that this was disturbing and provided further evidence that trans youth shouldn't be allowed to transition, since they clearly can't grasp the long-term consequences of transition. My perspective on this incident is that we need to reassess how information is presented to trans youth. Instead of taking resources away from trans youth, we should be researching how we can best inform young people of risks involved in transition as well as benefits. As an illustrator and designer, I can verify that I comprehend information better when it's presented in visually interesting pamphlets or videos, as opposed to dryly delivered by a doctor, and maybe you receive a very long list of information on a white piece of paper in really small font. So, from community-centered methods, we can learn about subjectivity, um, biological subjectivity, as well as subjective perspectives, is what was mentioned in the documentary. But of course, this is just subjectivity in general and valuing subjective data, as Eric Gordon talks about in the end of the documentary. And then awareness of biases as well. So, in many interactions and community-centered methods, there's the awareness of biases, check-ins on biases, conversations within the group to speak about how one another's perspectives may be influencing each other, and just a lot more transparency and open dialogue. Young people are capable of understanding complex information. We just have to make sure that we're delivering it effectively, which means redesigning or designing these solutions alongside members of the trans community. So, yeah, we need to start listening to each other. So, thank you.